The fog that night did not simply cover the ground. It erased the world. Across England it spread like a silent tide, creeping over hills, fields, rivers, and towns, until the entire countryside disappeared beneath a thick white blanket. Villages vanished, roads disappeared, even the glow of distant cities faded into nothing. From the ground, it felt suffocating, but from the sky, it was terrifying. High above the clouds, a Lancaster bomber was making its long journey home from Germany. The crew had already survived the most dangerous part of the mission. Hours earlier, they had crossed into enemy territory, flown through exploding anti-aircraft fire, and dodged German night fighters hunting them in the dark. Now they were over England, home, or at least they should have been. The pilot leaned forward in his seat and stared through the windshield, trying to see through the endless white layer below. Normally, by this point in the flight, he would have spotted something familiar: the faint glow of coastal towns, the winding shape of a river, or the reassuring lights of an RAF airfield. But tonight, there was nothing. The fog below them was absolute. It looked like someone had painted over the entire country with a solid sheet of white. Inside the bomber, the engines hummed with a tired rhythm. The aircraft had been in the air for hours, and every man on board felt the strain. The navigator wiped frost from a small side window with his gloved hand and pressed his face close to the glass. Still nothing. The radio suddenly crackled with voices from other bombers returning from the same mission. Visibility 0. Fuel running low. Attempting descent. The voices sounded tense, sometimes panicked. Then one transmission ended abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than any warning. Every crewman understood what had happened. Somewhere below, another bomber had descended into the fog and failed to find the runway. The pilot glanced down at his fuel gauge. The needle was almost touching empty. 5 minutes of fuel, maybe less. He tightened his grip on the control column. He had flown missions over Berlin, over Essen, and over Hamburg. He had watched searchlights sweep the sky and seen flak bursts explode around his aircraft. But this situation felt far worse. There was no enemy to fight, no target to bomb. Just fog. Endless fog. The navigator leaned closer to the window again, hoping to catch even the faintest glimpse of land. But the fog swallowed everything. Another voice came over the radio. "Control tower, we can't see anything. We're losing altitude." Static. Then silence. The crew in the Lancaster exchanged nervous glances. No one needed to explain what that meant. A crash in fog rarely produced a dramatic explosion. Sometimes there was only a dull thump heard miles away through the mist. Then nothing. Another crew gone. The pilot whispered quietly to himself, "Not like this." The bomber continued forward through the dark sky while the fog below remained unchanged. Then suddenly the flight engineer leaned toward the window. "Hold on, do you see that?" At first the pilot thought it was his imagination. A faint glow appeared far below the aircraft. It looked like a distant fire burning somewhere on the ground. But the glow slowly grew brighter, and then something strange happened. Instead of flickering randomly like a normal fire, the light stretched into a long, straight line. Then a second line appeared beside it. 2 glowing streaks cut across the fog. The entire crew leaned forward in disbelief. They weren't fires from a crash. They were too straight, too perfect. The pilot blinked twice, convinced his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. But the glow kept growing stronger. The 2 lines of light became blazing rivers of fire stretching along the ground. And suddenly, the fog began to move. The flames produced enormous heat that pushed the cold air upward. Steam rolled and twisted above the runway as the fog was forced away from the ground. From the sky, it looked like someone had carved a tunnel through the mist. The pilot grabbed the radio microphone. "What in God's name is that?" The reply came calmly from the control tower. "That's your runway, lad." For a moment, the crew simply stared. Landing between walls of fire sounded insane, but it was also the only thing visible in a country that had vanished into fog. The pilot lowered the Lancaster carefully toward the blazing corridor. The closer the bomber descended, the more intense the heat became. Turbulence rocked the aircraft as rising hot air struck the wings. The flames reflected across the metal fuselage, turning the entire cockpit orange. Still, the pilot continued downward. Landing gear lowered, flaps extended. The bomber passed through the final layer of fog, and suddenly the runway appeared beneath them, glowing between two roaring walls of fire. The pilot committed. The wheel struck the runway with a violent jolt. Brakes screeched as the aircraft rolled forward through steam and orange light. Finally, the bomber slowed and came to a stop. Inside the cockpit, the crew remained completely silent. They had survived. What none of them realized at that moment was that the fiery runway which saved them was not an accident. It was part of one of the most unusual and brilliant inventions of the entire war. Its name was FIDO, and it worked by setting the runway on fire. To understand why anyone would ever set an entire runway on fire, you have to understand how deadly fog had become during the war. In the early years of World War II, Britain's Bomber Command flew thousands of night missions over occupied Europe and Germany. These missions were already incredibly dangerous. German anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with exploding shells. Searchlights tried to trap bombers in bright cones of light. Night fighters hunted them through the darkness. Many aircraft never returned, but the RAF soon discovered something shocking. A huge number of bombers were not being lost over enemy territory. They were being lost over Britain itself. After surviving hours of combat, crews returning home would arrive over their airfields only to discover that thick fog had completely covered the runway. The pilots could not see the ground. They could not see runway lights. Sometimes they couldn't even see the wingtip of their own aircraft. They would circle in the sky, hoping the fog would lift, but their fuel tanks were almost empty. Soon the engines would begin to sputter, and eventually the aircraft would have no choice but to descend blindly. Many never found the runway. Instead, they crashed into fields, forests, or small villages hidden beneath the fog. Entire crews disappeared only a few miles from safety. Ground crews at RAF airfields knew the sound too well. They would stand in the fog listening to the distant engines of returning bombers circling overhead. Then suddenly there would be a dull impact somewhere in the distance. Another crew gone. Commanders were furious. Losing trained airmen to weather was unacceptable, especially when those men had already survived enemy defenses. Engineers were ordered to find a solution, but fog is one of the hardest natural obstacles to overcome. Floodlights were tested first. The idea was simple. If the runway was bright enough, pilots might see it through the fog. But the opposite happened. The light simply reflected off the fog and created a glowing white wall that blinded the pilots even more. Radio guidance systems were improved, but they still required pilots to see the ground during the final moments of landing. Nothing worked. Then one scientist suggested something that sounded almost absurd. Sir Henry Tizard, one of Britain's leading scientific advisors during the war, asked a question that most engineers initially dismissed. What if we burned the fog away? At first, people laughed. Fog is made of tiny droplets of water suspended in the air. Water cannot burn. But Tizard was not talking about burning the fog itself. He was talking about heating the air around it. If the air along the runway could be heated intensely enough, the warm air would rise rapidly upward. This rising air might push the fog away from the ground and create a clear corridor where pilots could land. It was a bold idea. It was also extremely dangerous. But Britain was at war, and desperate problems sometimes required radical solutions. Experiments began in 1942. Engineers installed rows of burners along a small runway and pumped petrol through them. When the fuel ignited, flames shot upward along the sides of the airstrip. At first, the results were disappointing. The heat disturbed the fog slightly, but the mist quickly settled back into place. The engineers increased the fuel flow. The flames became taller and hotter. Still, the fog refused to disappear. For weeks, the tests continued with little success. Some engineers began to doubt the idea entirely. Then one night during a particularly thick fog, they decided to push the system to its absolute limit. Fuel pumps were opened fully. Petrol rushed through the pipelines. When the ignition systems ignited, enormous flames erupted along the runway. The heat was almost unbearable. Some engineers had to step back because the air near the flames felt like standing next to a furnace. And then, something remarkable happened. The fog lifted. Not slowly, but suddenly. The rising hot air punched upward like a giant invisible column. The fog above the runway was forced into the sky, leaving a clear gap directly over the landing strip. For the first time, the runway was visible through the fog. Someone watching the experiment reportedly shouted, "We've got it! We've bloody got it!" The system worked. It was soon given a name: FIDO, Fog Investigation and Dispersion Operation. Turning this experimental idea into a full operational system required enormous effort. Engineers began installing FIDO at selected RAF airfields used by bomber squadrons. Long trenches were dug on both sides of the runway. Inside these trenches, thick steel pipes were laid from one end of the landing strip to the other. These pipes were connected to massive fuel tanks buried nearby. When activated, powerful pumps forced petrol through the pipelines at high pressure. Jets spaced along the pipes released the fuel, and ignition systems lit the streams of petrol instantly. The result was a continuous wall of fire running along the entire length of the runway. The flames generated tremendous heat. This heat forced warm air upward, pushing the fog away and creating a clear path above the airfield. But the system had many dangers. A single leak in the pipeline could cause an explosion. The flames could rise high enough to damage aircraft if the pilot descended too low. And the fuel consumption was staggering. In heavy fog operations, FIDO could burn tens of thousands of gallons of petrol in a single night. In a country where fuel was rationed and every drop mattered, that seemed almost unthinkable. But the RAF made its decision. Saving trained bomber crews was far more valuable than saving fuel. Construction crews worked quickly. Pumps were installed in protected bunkers. Ignition systems were tested repeatedly. Ground crews trained for emergency activation procedures. Many men burned their hands during training. Others suffered from heat exhaustion while working near the flames. But they continued, because somewhere over the North Sea, another bomber might already be flying toward England with empty fuel tanks and no runway in sight. And when FIDO was finally ready for real combat use, it would produce one of the most extraordinary sights of the entire war: runways on fire and bombers flying home through flame. The first real use of FIDO during an emergency changed everything. It happened on a night when the fog over the airfield was so thick that ground crews could barely see a few steps in front of them. Men moved through the mist like shadows, bumping into equipment and shouting to one another just to stay organized. Above them, the sky was filled with bombers returning from Germany. One after another, they called the control tower with the same desperate message: "We can't see the runway. Fuel running low. Attempting descent." The controllers inside the tower knew exactly what that meant. If the fog didn't clear soon, those aircraft would run out of fuel and begin crashing across the countryside. The decision had to be made quickly. Finally, the order came down: "Activate FIDO, full power." Instantly, the ground crews sprang into action. The fuel pumps roared to life beneath the airfield as petrol surged through the underground pipes. Technicians ran along the trenches beside the runway, checking pressure valves and gauges. The pipes vibrated violently as thousands of gallons of fuel rushed through them. Even before ignition, the men standing nearby could feel the heat beginning to rise from the system. Then the signal was given. A spark flashed inside the trench. In the next second, a line of fire exploded along the runway. The flames raced down the pipes faster than a man could run, spreading across the entire length of the landing strip. A second line ignited on the opposite side. Suddenly, the invisible runway was framed by two blazing rivers of fire. The heat was intense. Ground crews stepped back instinctively as the flames roared upward. But the most dramatic change happened above the runway. The fog began to move.
The rising heat forced the cold air upward, pushing the thick mist away from the ground. Steam rose in twisting white clouds as the fog lifted into the sky. Within moments, a clear corridor appeared above the runway. For the first time that night, pilots circling above the airfield could see something below them. In one Lancaster bomber, the flight engineer shouted excitedly, "There! Look down there!" The pilot leaned forward and saw the glow. 2 bright lines of fire stretching through the fog. He grabbed the radio. "Control tower, confirm, is that the runway?" The response came instantly. "Affirmative, bring her in." The pilot carefully lowered the bomber toward the fiery corridor. As the aircraft descended, the crew could feel the heat rising from the flames below. The air around the bomber shimmered with turbulence created by the rising hot air. The entire runway glowed orange beneath them. For a moment, the pilot wondered if he had gone mad. Landing between walls of fire went against every instinct a pilot had. But it was the only visible path in a country that had disappeared into fog. He committed to the landing. The bomber dropped through the final layer of mist, and the runway suddenly appeared clearly between the flames. The wheels slammed onto the concrete. The aircraft bounced once before settling down as the pilot fought to keep it straight. Finally, the bomber rolled to a stop. Inside the cockpit, the crew sat frozen for several seconds. Then someone laughed. It started as a nervous chuckle and quickly turned into a wave of relief that spread through the aircraft. They were alive. Behind them, another bomber was already descending through the fiery corridor. That aircraft had lost an engine during the mission and was barely able to stay in the air, yet it managed to land safely. Then another bomber appeared, and another. To the ground crews watching from the side of the runway, the sight was unforgettable. Aircraft emerged from the fog like ghosts and suddenly became solid machines again as they touched down between the flames. Each safe landing triggered cheers from the exhausted men on the ground. Word about the system spread quickly among bomber crews. Soon, pilots returning from missions knew that if fog covered their airfield, there might still be a chance. There might be fire waiting for them. Throughout the war, FIDO-equipped airfields became the last hope for many damaged or fuel-starved aircraft. Bombers arrived with bullet holes across their wings. Some came in missing control surfaces. A few landed with only one functioning engine. One Halifax bomber famously landed with its fuel tanks completely empty the moment its wheels touched the runway, but they landed. FIDO didn't make the landing easy. The flames were dangerous. The heat sometimes warped metal panels on aircraft flying too low. Birds flying through the flames could ignite instantly. The noise was deafening, and the fuel consumption was unbelievable. On some nights, engineers burned more than 50,000 gallons of petrol just to keep the fog away from the runway. Local farmers miles away often saw the orange glow lighting up the sky and believed German bombers were attacking again. But none of that mattered to the men flying those aircraft, because every gallon of petrol burned meant another crew might survive. Pilots later described the experience of landing with FIDO in many different ways. Some said it felt like flying through the gates of hell. Others said the flames looked like molten metal pouring across the ground. But nearly all of them agreed on one thing. Seeing those flames meant safety. It meant home. The psychological effect on bomber crews was enormous. Before FIDO existed, the final part of every mission was often the most terrifying. After surviving enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns, pilots still feared that fog might kill them just miles from home. But once FIDO became operational, that fear changed. They knew that somewhere in Britain there might be a runway burning through the fog waiting for them, and that knowledge gave them confidence. Crews were willing to fly deeper missions into Germany because they believed they could make it back. Commanders approved more daring operations because the risk of losing aircraft to fog had decreased dramatically. FIDO was not a weapon. It didn't destroy enemy factories or shoot down aircraft, but it saved something just as important: people. By the end of the war, RAF records estimated that FIDO had saved more than 10,000 airmen. 10,000 men who would likely have died in crashes caused by fog. 10,000 families who received letters saying their sons, husbands, or fathers had made it home safely. When the war finally ended in 1945, the need for FIDO slowly disappeared. Bombers no longer crossed the North Sea every night. The skies above Britain grew quiet again. Without the desperate need to guide damaged aircraft home, the massive system of pipes and pumps became unnecessary. Fuel tanks were drained. Ignition systems were shut down. The trenches beside the runways were eventually filled in. Grass began to grow where flames had once roared higher than a man. New technologies replaced the fiery system in later decades. Radar landing systems and improved navigation equipment made it possible to land safely without burning thousands of gallons of petrol. But those technologies never created the same unforgettable sight. Pilots who flew years later would never experience descending through a wall of fog and suddenly seeing two blazing rivers of fire cutting through the darkness. They would never feel the heat shaking their wings as they flew towards safety, and they would never know the strange relief of seeing flames and realizing that those flames meant survival. For the men who lived through it, FIDO was more than an invention. It was a miracle, built from desperation, engineering, and courage. A runway on fire, a path carved through fog, and one of the most extraordinary life-saving inventions of World War II that almost no one remembers today.